The paternity test results just came back. Tyler, my 3-year-old son, isn't my husband Mark's biological child. But what happened when I tried to explain it was just genetics will shock you. 3 other men got tested too. Mark stood there holding that stupid piece of paper with tears in his eyes and said, "Tyler isn't even mine, Jessica." And I couldn't believe he was making this about him when I was the one dealing with everyone pointing fingers at me. I told him, "You're still his dad regardless of some stupid test. Why are you being so dramatic about genetics?" But he just kept staring at those numbers like they meant something. The whole thing started because I made one innocent observation about how tiny Mark looked standing next to our 3-year-old son Tyler at his birthday party last month. Everyone was taking pictures, and I laughed and said, "Look how tiny Daddy is next to our big strong boy." Because honestly, Tyler is huge for his age, and Mark is only 5'7" on a good day. It was just a harmless comment about genetics, but apparently that makes me some kind of monster. Mark's face went all red and he pulled me aside and said, "That was embarrassing, Jessica," and I told him, "I was just making an observation. Don't be so sensitive," because that's literally all it was. His mom was standing right there when I said it, and she got this weird look on her face like I'd said something terrible, but I was just pointing out obvious facts about our family genetics. But let me explain how we got here, because everyone's acting like I'm this horrible person, when really I was just being honest about what I was seeing. Mark and I met 3 years ago, when I was 26, and working at Dr. Miller's dental office as the front desk administrator. He came in for a routine cleaning and was so nervous about the whole thing that I felt bad for him. He's an accountant at Henderson and Associates and makes decent money, but he's always been kind of insecure about his height and build. I'm 5'9", so I tower over him in heels, but I never made it an issue back then. We started dating, and everything was fine until I got pregnant 8 months later. Mark was over the moon about becoming a dad and kept talking about what our baby would look like. He'd say things like, "I hope he gets your height," and "maybe he'll be taller than his old man," which honestly should have been a clue that he was already worried about the genetics situation. Tyler was born in March and he was this massive baby, 9 pounds 4 ounces and 22 inches long. The nurses kept commenting on how big he was, and Mark would just beam with pride like he'd accomplished something. But as Tyler grew, it became more and more obvious that he didn't really look like Mark at all. Tyler has these bright green eyes, while Mark's are brown, and Tyler's hair is this gorgeous thick blonde, while Mark's is thin and dark. I never thought much of it because babies can look like anyone in the family tree, right? My dad was tall and blonde before he went bald, so I figured Tyler got those genes from my side. But Mark's family started making these little comments whenever we'd visit. His sister would say things like, "Wow, Tyler's going to be a basketball player," and his mom would get this pinched look and change the subject. The first time I really noticed the size difference was at Tyler's first birthday party. Mark was holding him for pictures, and our neighbor, Mrs. Chen, said, "Oh my goodness, Tyler looks like he could be Mark's big brother." And everyone laughed, but Mark didn't think it was funny. He put Tyler down and went inside to get more drinks, even though we had plenty. That's when I started making little jokes about it, because honestly, it was kind of cute how different they were. At Tyler's daycare pickup, I'd laugh and tell the other mums, Tyler definitely didn't get his size from Daddy, and they'd all giggle because it was so obvious. Mark would get quiet when I said things like that, but I thought he was just being shy about attention. Last summer at my company picnic, I was talking to my coworker Janet about how kids inherit traits, and I said Tyler's definitely going to be tall, like the men on my side of the family. He already makes Mark look like his little brother. And Janet laughed, but then I noticed Mark had overheard and he looked upset. When I asked him about it later, he said, "I don't like when you compare me to Tyler like that." And I told him, "I'm just making conversation about genetics. Don't be so sensitive." But the comments kept coming because, honestly, the difference was getting more obvious as Tyler grew. At family dinners, Mark's mom would measure Tyler against the wall and make these amazed sounds about how tall he was getting. I'd joke, "Good thing Tyler got the height genes from somewhere," and Mark would excuse himself to the bathroom. His dad started making comments too, like, That boy's going to be a linebacker," while looking at Mark like he was confused about something. The situation got worse at Christmas when my ex-boyfriend Derek showed up at my office holiday party. I hadn't seen him in almost 4 years, but he looked amazing. He's 6'3" and works construction, so he's got this incredible build. Derek met Tyler for the first time and immediately said, "Wow, Jessica, he's going to be huge like me," and started playing with him. Tyler was laughing and climbing all over Derek like they'd known each other forever. Mark watched the whole thing with this weird expression, and later in the car he said, "Tyler really seemed to connect with Derek," and I told him, "Kids just like tall, strong guys, it's normal." But Mark kept bringing it up for days afterward, asking questions about my relationship with Derek and when exactly we broke up. I told him, "We dated 4 years ago, Mark. Why does it matter?" But he wouldn't drop it. That's when Mark started getting really paranoid about everything. He'd ask me random questions about Tyler's conception timeline, and I'd have to remind him that I went on that girls' trip to Miami right around when Tyler was conceived. He'd say things like, "Are you sure about the dates?" And I'd tell him, "Of course I'm sure. Why would I lie about that?" But he kept pushing and pushing like he thought I was hiding something. The final straw was Tyler's 3rd birthday party last month. All our friends and family were there, taking pictures of Tyler blowing out his candles. When Mark picked Tyler up to help him, someone yelled, "Get a photo of the big boy and his little daddy," and everyone laughed. I said, "Tyler definitely didn't get his genes from the short side of the family," and Mark's face went white. His brother Jason was recording on his phone and caught the whole thing. Later, Jason showed Mark the video, and you could hear me saying, "Look how tiny Mark looks next to our giant boy. Good thing I have good taste in genetics," while everyone was laughing. Mark watched it 3 times and then said, "We need to talk, Jessica." He cornered me in the kitchen and said, "I want a paternity test, just like that, no warning or discussion." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him, "Are you seriously questioning if Tyler is your son over some harmless family jokes?" And he said, "It's not just the jokes, Jessica, it's everything. The timing, his appearance, how you talk about other men." I was so hurt that he would even suggest such a thing. I told him, "Tyler is your son, Mark. How can you doubt that?" But he was already looking up DNA testing labs on his phone. I tried to talk sense into him, but he'd made up his mind. He said, "If Tyler is mine, then the test will prove it and we can move on." But I knew this was really about his insecurity issues. We fought about it for weeks. I kept telling him, "You're destroying our family over your paranoia, and if you really trusted me, you wouldn't need some test." But Mark wouldn't budge. He'd already contacted 3 different labs and scheduled the appointment. I told him, "Fine, but when this test proves Tyler is yours, you owe me and Tyler a huge apology." The day we went to get tested was absolutely horrible, and I still can't believe Mark put our family through that ordeal. We had to drive 40 minutes to this sterile medical facility downtown because Mark had researched which lab was most accurate, like he was planning some military operation. Tyler was cranky from the car ride and kept asking, "Where are we going, Mummy?" And I had to make up some story about visiting a special doctor for a checkup. The waiting room was full of other families, dealing with their own dramas, and you could feel the tension in the air. There was this older couple whispering and looking at papers, probably dealing with inheritance issues. A young woman sat alone, crying quietly, while texting on her phone. Tyler wanted to play with the toys in the kids' corner, but Mark said, "Don't touch anything, Tyler. We won't be here long," in this cold voice that made Tyler shrink back against me. I tried to keep things normal for Tyler's sake, but Mark was making it impossible with his funeral director attitude. He sat there checking his phone every 30 seconds and tapping his foot like he couldn't wait to get this over with. When Tyler asked, "Why is Daddy being grumpy?" I told him, "Daddy's just tired, sweetheart," but Mark heard me and gave me this look like I was the villain for trying to protect our son. The intake process was humiliating because we had to explain to the receptionist why we needed paternity testing. She handed us forms asking about alleged fathers and relationship timelines, and I felt like we were admitting to some crime. Mark filled out everything with precise, angry handwriting while I tried to distract Tyler with a picture book I'd brought. Tyler kept asking heartbreaking questions like, "Are we sick, Mommy?" And "Why does the lady need our spit?" I explained it was just a routine test to make sure he was healthy, but he wasn't buying it. He's smart for his age and could tell something serious was happening. When the nurse called our names, Tyler grabbed my hand tight and said, "I don't want to go, Mommy," and I almost started crying right there. The actual testing room felt like an interrogation chamber with Mark sitting there like a statue. The technician was this young guy named David, who tried to be friendly, but you could tell he dealt with family drama all day. He explained the cheek swab process to Tyler, saying, "We're just going to tickle the inside of your mouth with this special brush," but Tyler wasn't having it. Tyler started crying when David approached with the swab and climbed into my lap, saying, "I want to go home now." I had to hold him while David did the test, and Tyler kept looking at Mark like he wanted his daddy to rescue him, but Mark just sat there watching like Tyler was evidence being collected. It took everything I had not to tell Mark what I really thought about putting our baby through this trauma. When it was Mark's turn, he opened his mouth like a robot and stared at the ceiling. David tried making small talk, saying, "Your son's got some impressive height genes," and Mark actually laughed bitterly and said, "Yeah, that's what we're here to find out." I wanted to kick him under the table for being so inappropriate in front of Tyler. The worst part was when David took my sample because Tyler watched everything and asked, "Why does everyone have to do the mouth thing?" I told him, "Sometimes doctors need to check our family genetics, sweetie," which felt like such a betrayal. Tyler nodded seriously and said, "Like how I got tall like Mommy," and my heart shattered because he had no idea his whole world was about to explode. But here's where it gets really crazy. While we were waiting for results, Mark's paranoia got even worse. He started going through my old photos and text messages, looking for evidence of something. He found pictures from my Miami trip and started asking about every guy in the background. He found old conversations with Derek from years ago and printed them out like they were court documents. That's when he discovered I'd been on dating apps longer than I'd told him. I was still active on Tinder for like 2 weeks after we'd made things official, but I told him, "I forgot to delete it. That's not the same as cheating." But Mark was keeping a timeline of everything in a notebook like some kind of detective. Then he started contacting people from my past. He called Derek directly and asked him about our relationship timeline. Derek told him we'd broken up 4 years ago, which was true, but then Derek mentioned we'd run into each other in Miami during my girls' trip. I never told Mark about that because it was completely innocent. We just had drinks and caught up as friends. Mark confronted me about the Derek thing and I explained. It was just a coincidence that he was in Miami the same weekend. We barely hung out. But Mark had this crazy look in his eyes and said, "You lied to me, Jessica. What else are you lying about?" I told him I didn't lie. I just didn't mention running into an ex because it wasn't important. But apparently it was important to Mark because he hired some kind of private investigator to look into my Miami trip. Can you believe that? He spent our savings on a PI to investigate his own girlfriend, like I was some kind of criminal. The investigator found hotel records and credit card receipts and built this whole timeline of my weekend. That's when things got really ugly. The investigator found out that Derek had stayed at the same hotel as me and my girlfriends. He also found bar receipts showing I'd bought drinks for multiple guys that weekend. When Mark showed me the report, I told him I was on a girls' trip having fun. That's what people do in Miami. But he acted like I'd committed some major crime. Then the PI found my old Instagram posts from that weekend, including photos with Derek and 2 other guys I'd met at the hotel bar. Mark printed out every single photo and laid them on our kitchen table like evidence. He pointed to each guy and said, "Which one of these men could be Tyler's father, Jessica?" And I couldn't believe he was seriously asking me that. I told him, "Tyler is your son, Mark. Stop doing this to our family." But he just kept staring at those photos. He'd circled the guys who looked tall or blonde and made notes about their physical features. It was honestly scary how obsessed he'd become with this whole thing. The worst part was when Mark started involving Tyler in his investigation. He'd measure Tyler constantly and compare his height to charts online. He'd study Tyler's face, looking for resemblances to me or to the guys in the Miami photos. He even took Tyler to his pediatrician and asked about genetic testing for physical traits. That's when I realized Mark had completely lost his mind over this paternity thing. I tried to get him to see a therapist, but he said, "I don't need therapy, Jessica. I need the truth." He'd spend hours online researching DNA testing and paternity fraud like he was preparing for a trial. Meanwhile, our friends and family were starting to notice how weird Mark was acting. At dinners, he'd stare at Tyler, measuring him with his eyes. He'd ask strange questions about pregnancy timelines and conception dates. My mum pulled me aside and said, "What's wrong with Mark lately? He seems obsessed with Tyler's height." I had to make excuses for his behavior, but honestly, I was getting embarrassed. At Tyler's preschool events, Mark would compare Tyler to other kids and make notes in his phone. The other parents started avoiding us because Mark's behavior was so strange. I told him, "You're making everyone uncomfortable with this height obsession," but he said, "I'm just gathering information." Then the DNA results came back and our whole world exploded. Mark opened the email on his laptop while I was making Tyler's lunch. I heard him make this choking sound, and when I looked over, his face was completely white. He turned the screen toward me, and there it was in black and white. Mark was not Tyler's biological father. The probability of paternity was 0%. I stared at those results for probably 5 minutes before I could speak. Finally, I said, "There must be some mistake. Those labs make errors all the time." But Mark was already printing out additional copies. He'd also ordered tests from 2 other companies, and they'd all come back with the same results. Tyler was definitely not his son. Mark looked at me with these dead eyes and said, "Who is Tyler's father, Jessica?" And honestly, I didn't know what to say. I'd convinced myself that Tyler had to be Mark's because the timing seemed right, but obviously I'd miscalculated something. I told him I don't understand how this happened, and he said, "I think you understand perfectly." That's when he showed me the other results. While we'd been waiting for Tyler's paternity test, Mark had somehow convinced Derek and 2 other guys from Miami to get tested too. Derek's results came back negative, but one of the other guys, this construction worker named Brad, who I'd barely remembered, came back as a 99.9% match. I was so shocked I had to sit down. Brad was this random guy I'd met at the hotel bar, and we'd hung out for one night. I barely even remembered his last name, but apparently he'd remembered me, because when Mark contacted him through Facebook, he'd agreed to the test immediately. Brad even sent Mark photos of himself as a kid, and the resemblance to Tyler was honestly undeniable. Mark laid out all the test results on the table, like he was presenting evidence in court. He had Tyler's results, his own negative results, Derek's negative results, and Brad's positive results. He also had printed conversations between him and Brad, where Brad admitted we'd spent the night together in Miami. Looking at all that evidence, I couldn't deny what had obviously happened. I tried to explain to Mark that it had just been one night, and I'd been drinking, and I honestly thought Tyler was his son. I told him, "I never meant for this to happen, Mark. I thought you were Tyler's father." But he just kept staring at those DNA results. Finally, he said, "Pack your things, Jessica. I can't look at you right now." I begged him to think about Tyler and how this would affect our family. But Mark said, "Tyler isn't our family, Jessica. Tyler is your family with some stranger from Miami." He was already on his phone calling his lawyer about custody arrangements and divorce papers. I told him, "We can work through this, Mark." But he said, "There's nothing to work through. You lied to me for 3 years." Within a week, Mark had moved out of our apartment and filed for divorce. He also contacted Brad directly and arranged for Brad to meet Tyler and start paying child support. Brad lives in Orlando and works construction, but he seemed excited about having a son he never knew existed. He started video calling Tyler twice a week and planning weekend visits. The whole situation became public really quickly because Mark's family couldn't keep their mouths shut. His mum called my mum and told her everything. Soon, all our friends knew about the paternity test results, and I became the woman who'd lied about her son's father for 3 years. People at work started treating me differently once the story got around. The worst part was watching Tyler adjust to everything. He didn't understand why Mark wasn't coming home, or why this new man Brad was suddenly in his life, claiming to be his real daddy. Tyler would ask me, "Where did Daddy Mark go?" And I'd have to explain that Mark wasn't actually his daddy, which confused him even more. Brad started sending Tyler gifts and photos of his own childhood, trying to build a relationship. Tyler liked the presents, but he kept asking for Mark because that's who he'd known as his father for 3 years. I tried to maintain some contact between Tyler and Mark, but Mark said it was too painful and he needed to focus on moving on with his life. Meanwhile, Brad wanted to be involved in every decision about Tyler's upbringing. He started paying substantial child support since he makes good money in construction, but he also wanted input on schools and medical decisions. I went from having one co-parent to having a completely different co-parent who was essentially a stranger. The legal situation got complicated because Mark's name was on Tyler's birth certificate, but he wasn't the biological father. We had to go through this whole process to remove Mark legally and add Brad as the official father. Tyler had to get a new birth certificate and everything, which felt like erasing the first 3 years of his life. Our friend group completely split apart after everything came out. Some people thought Mark was being dramatic and should have just accepted Tyler regardless of biology. Other people thought I was terrible for lying about something so important for 3 years. Most people just avoided both of us because the whole situation was too messy and awkward. My family was disappointed but supportive, while Mark's family acted like I'd personally attacked them. His mum sent me this long email about how I'd destroyed their family and stolen 3 years of Mark's life. His sister blocked me on all social media and told mutual friends I was a pathological liar who ruined everything. At work, things became uncomfortable because several co-workers knew Mark through professional connections. Dr. Miller called me into his office and said he'd heard about my personal situation and hoped it wouldn't affect my performance. I assured him everything was fine, but I could tell people were talking about me behind my back. The hardest part was helping Tyler understand why his whole world had changed overnight. He went from having Mark as his daddy to having this stranger Brad who lived in another city. Tyler would show Brad his toys and talk about things he used to do with Mark, but Brad didn't know any of those memories or experiences. Mark moved out that week and refused to see Tyler again. Friends stopped calling and my co-workers got weird about the whole situation. Work became awkward when Dr. Miller mentioned he'd heard about my complicated family situation. Now I'm dealing with custody arrangements with a man I barely know, while Tyler keeps asking where his real daddy went. I still don't understand why everyone turned against me when I was just making observations about genetics. Subscribe if you think some jokes should never be made in relationships. Hit like if you've ever seen someone destroy their own marriage. What would you do if your partner constantly compared you to their exes in front of everyone?